I'm good. Can you all hear me?
Hey.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious. You're fascinating to me. So I was like curious what changed in terms of how you view things economically, socially, before getting caught or before going to jail, and in the time since. Because like to me, it seems like it's unusual, right? I think you got more media attention than like you're not the only guy playing those games at the time, right? It's interesting to me that they were so hyper fixated on you, and then on top of that, it does seem like you've shifted a little bit in certain things. You were talking about prison reform. You were talking about some of these other issues. Do you think you've changed substantially in how you view things and how you view the world, how you view classes, economics, all of these things?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question. So as I get older, I'd say that I just become less and less sure of myself. I think when I was 21, I was a real beast. I was a little bit like the guy that called me a minute ago, or two questions ago, but insufferable, an asshole that nobody liked. And as I get older and older, I've become a little more mellow and open-minded and sort of contemplative. I don't think I've changed that much. I mean, I'm still sort of a small government, libertarian type of person. One thing I've changed a lot on is, I'd say, race. So I've always sort of been pretty open-minded to this stuff, but more and more I do believe that there is something called systematic or systemic racism, which is something I kind of didn't believe in before.
Did that change kind of come through in prison?
It didn't.
Or is that just generally time? It's just been
I'd
more
say-
and more you've become more.
I'd say both, but certainly in prison helped crystallize it. Because remember, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I saw the effect, or I saw sort of. It's hard to put into words, but like I could see sort of what was going on. That there was this sort of, for especially for Black people, well, not beat around the bush, that there's sort of this prison pipeline, that is really alarming. And
Yeah, I mean, it's poverty, right? I'm sorry for
it's not
interrupting.
just poverty. It really isn't just poverty. It's interesting. It's a mix
Of course.
It's certainly poverty that doesn't help at all. Poverty is a part and parcel of it. But I think part of it is culture too. And again, that's a hard thing to say, and most people aren't willing to say it. But I sort of blame a bit of culture too, and that means white culture, that means Black culture, that means a lot of things. And I think it takes time, So I do think that this problem will be solved and healed eventually. But I do think like this has just been a sort of a clusterfuck for the Black community, and it's just fascinating to sort of watch it. It's terribly tragic, of course, but it's fascinating to sort of see it up close and personal in prison, and to distill it into actual people you meet. Right? It's easy to sort of look at a statistic, and this goes back to the pharma sort of story as well, is that statistics don't leave you with a personal feeling. Martin Shkreli leaves you with a personal feeling. Fuck that guy, right? Whereas, Pfizer's earnings went up 10% is not something you're going to react to. And the same thing here is that if you hear the statistic that 1 in 4 Black males will end up in prison, it's a startling statistic in and of
Yeah,
itself.
no, that's what I was saying before is why you fascinated, because I think you were latched onto, so your trial and incarceration, at the end of the day, white collar crime is ubiquitous, right? Like, and it's far more damaging than any amount, I think, of violent crime, like a increasing crime rate versus, economic recessions and economic downfall. It's night and day, right? Yet they were so fixated on you, which
Well, I guess
could be, to a degree, justified.
Yeah.
But
I'm
it's
not-
interesting to me that...
Yeah. I'm not sure I
Right,
agree
sorry.
with what you're saying 100%, but one thing I think we could agree on is if a guy steals $1 million, he might go to jail for a couple years. If a Black guy robs a bank for $1 million, he's getting 25 or 30 years. Is that what you're trying to say, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there's that. I think we prioritize violent crime because it's scary. I think when we think about these crimes, something like you did, for most guys who do the type of shit that you did, we don't really think about that. It doesn't trigger the same emotional response as hearing about a dude who's on the subway, cutting people, right?
And then maybe it shouldn't. I mean, I don't know that. I mean, our criminal justice system certainly punishes violent crime more than nonviolent crime, but I would imagine that's a consensus view, and your view is actually an outlier. I think most people want to punish violent crime more than nonviolent crime.
I would tend to agree. So, like, the reason that I think I come to this, So, for instance, I think end of the day, like people are going to find a way to make ends meet, and they're going. We're meant to drive, right? I'm going to grow my assets. You can take a moral opposition to the things that you did, but at the end of the day, you're not alone. And the level of incentivization to actually stop people like you from doing what you did is nowhere near as extreme as, like you yourself acknowledge, the way we look at crime from like impoverished communities, black, white, whatever ethnicity, culture, whatever the impetus there is. But it's just interesting to me. And it sounds like you going through it have started to shift a little bit in how you kind of perceive these things. Where do you see yourself going from here?
Yeah, I mean, so just to wrap a bow on that, I mean, I grew up in a community that was extremely diverse, virtually every race, every ethnicity in Enclave in Brooklyn. And what's interesting is that I left that for kind of more prosperous, place,
Mm-hmm.
2 miles away in Manhattan. And the point is that, in prison, I sort of got to almost reconnect with maybe not the same people, but the same types of people that I knew in Brooklyn growing up that I avoided. I didn't want to be around necessarily those types of people. I knew kind of the kind of people I wanted to be around were people who were wealthy and smart and smart, or I should say educated maybe. That was kind of where I wanted to go. So going to prison was kind of like coming back to my origins, and something that I was deeply afraid of was being poor or being uneducated, and that just was ingrained in me from the start. And seeing it was really plaintive and difficult. Not for me, because I knew that I'd go back to wealth and intellectual pursuits. The problem was, what do you do about the guy who's 40 years old, dropped out of high school, has a reading level of fourth grader, and doesn't have a whole lot to do other than at least to make a decent or honest living, or some people would use the word. Let's see. I guess you could use the word decent, but other people, not humiliating.
Sustainable, the ability to at least pursue goals. Right?
Yeah, or just not menial. I think a lot of people find the idea of like, well, yes, that person could be a janitor or a truck driver, but for a lot of people, I think the word is dignity that I'm looking for. That a lot of people feel like that's a job without dignity. And again, a crueler person might say, well, if that's the job you're qualified for, then screw you. That's what all the job you're going to get. And that's a very Darwinian kind of like perspective. But, if you look at it from a humanistic perspective, this is a person that, obviously maybe they didn't have a good family figure, whether it's a father figure or a mother figure or either. They were misled, possibly basically indoctrinated by a gang or a culture that was really corrosive. And that person's, that early upbringing, which is so important, was just so absent and difficult that it ended up creating a monster of a person. It's not that person's fault, at the end of the day. Little kids aren't smart enough to determine if they're being misguided or not, right? And little kids who grow up in Yonkers or grow up in the Bronx or wherever, and they get, and I'm not saying that every single person that grew up in the Bronx ended up this way, because far be it. That's not true at all. There are plenty of billionaires and successful people from those places. But some of these people are more prone than others to be taken advantage of, to be indoctrinated for somebody else's benefit. For example, here's a gun, go shoot that guy. That's somebody else's benefit. And it's sort of taking advantage of that person for, and I met thousands of people like this. And some people understood it, some people didn't, some people wanted to fight it, some people didn't. But it's really something that I'm sort of, I hate to use the word awakened to, because I'm not a woke person, but I think the idea that like this does exist is and denying it is sort of foolish.
Right.
That's one.
I know even as early when you're talking about, especially like an area like Brooklyn, like we don't teach success, right? We don't teach how to manipulate debt. We don't teach how to deal with taxes at a young age. And the things that actually dictate how far you can push the ball, that's not something we generally teach unless you're already in a position where you have access to.
You're on your
going
way.
to private schools. You're going to
Exactly. Yeah.
So like, it's I don't know.
So I don't see myself like
the way that it's happened to.
Yeah, I don't see myself doing something about it, which is just kind of the important part, right? It's frustrating to sort of see it, and I certainly knew about it before, but it really crystallized quite a bit. And I can kind of criticize like the people that pay lip service to it and the people that are in a position to do something about it. Like for me, I don't see why Google or Microsoft or Facebook can't hire, 10,000 apprentice programmers from the inner city and train them to be something bigger than they are now. And again, some of these bigger tech companies can solve some of these economic problems. I'm not sure government can. When every time government tries to solve one of these problems, they're solving it in this like backward way that won't really work and creates all these other weird incentives. It's really a matter of jobs and training and things like that. And I hesitate to say that like maybe the job givers should be involved in our upbringings earlier and earlier, and that we've had this perpetuation of this myth that like school is the answer to everything, and that the university especially is the cure for all that ails you. And I think we've learned painfully that that's not the case, and that spending a ton of money at a sort of C-level college is not a good idea, and that liberal arts educations were built for the Victorian era, and that people should be programmers and data analysts and even IT maintenance people, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that we should probably start that process younger than we do, and maybe get a chance to get people to say, well, I'd rather not join this gang because in 4 years I'm going to be making this much money, and that's a better deal than being part of the Bloods. Whereas if the answer is, well, you're going to go to college, but you're going to be in debt, and when you're 22, you might start making half the money the drug dealer's making. That doesn't work for anybody with some common sense.
Right, and that's the interesting thing, right? Like, I didn't grow up in a good area either. I also grew up in very weird circumstances. But like to my mind, the kinds of people who sell drugs at a high level, all of these things, it's no different really than a CEO in terms of what they're doing, right? This is supply and demand. This is marketing. This is all of these things. The only real difference is it's illegal. And if it makes more sense for a kid who grew up, like you said, in the Bronx, in Queensbridge, wherever, that's a calculation. And when we start moralizing, we start getting into like why they do what they do, it gets really weird because there's so much rhetoric.
Well,
you brought up
there's still
being a libertarian earlier. Do you see that dichotomy as big government and small government? Because to me, it seems like there's a good regulation and bad regulation. It always felt strange to me to view things big and small.
Yeah, I tend to just think virtually all of government's actions, no matter how well intentioned, come out poorly. One counterexample that I like is the FDA.